When the housing market collapsed in 2008, millions of Americans lost their homes. To most, it was a tragedy. To Wall Street, it was an opportunity. What began as a wave of foreclosures soon turned into a blueprint, a roadmap for how to turn homes, neighborhoods, and entire cities into an investment class. For decades, buying a home had meant stability, a front porch, a mortgage, a predictable payment, and the comfort of knowing you owned the space where your children grew up. But in the years after the crash, that simple promise of ownership was quietly rewritten. The crisis that broke the American dream had opened a door, and through it stepped private equity. They came with spreadsheets, data models, and capital so vast that even regional banks couldn't compete. Companies like Blackstone, Cerberus, and Colony Capital began buying foreclosed properties by the thousands. In Atlanta, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and later in New York's outer boroughs, entire zip codes were absorbed in bulk, scooped up in auctions that lasted minutes, not months. The transformation wasn't visible at first. To the average person, the houses looked the same. But behind the deed, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in history, Wall Street owned the suburbs. What used to be a local landlord with a few properties was now a Delaware LLC managed by a fund in Manhattan. Rent checks no longer went to the retired couple next door. They were routed through algorithms that optimized every cent for yield. By 2015, tens of thousands of homes were controlled by just a handful of investment firms. They weren't buying to live or even to sell. They were buying to extract. The goal wasn't community, it was cash flow. Wall Street had discovered that housing, unlike stocks or bonds, carried something much more dependable. People had no choice but to pay for it. In a world of uncertainty, rent became the perfect commodity, predictable, unavoidable, and eternal. But this wasn't just about business. It was about control. When private equity entered the housing market, they brought with them a new logic, one that treated every property, every family, and every neighborhood as a line item on a quarterly report. In Brooklyn, tenants began noticing subtle changes. Maintenance requests went unanswered. Rent increases arrived with machine-like precision. Eviction filings surged, not because of personal disputes, but because of portfolio adjustments. Everything was automated, everything was efficient, and everything was detached. In a single decade, the definition of a home had changed. It was no longer a personal investment, but an institutional asset. The American dream had been securitized. It's easy to think of Wall Street as abstract, towers of glass, screens full of numbers, traders shouting across rooms. But in this new housing order, their reach extended into kitchens and bedrooms, through leases and payment apps, deep into the lives of people who had never set foot in Lower Manhattan. A single hedge fund could own thousands of rental homes scattered across the country, managed through layers of subsidiaries that disguised their reach. Tenants often had no idea who actually owned their home, and that was by design. The anonymity protected investors, but it also stripped accountability. When the heat broke, when a ceiling leaked, when a family was unfairly evicted, there was no one to call. Only an email address, and maybe an automated reply. Wall Street didn't just buy homes, it rewired how housing worked. Using data analytics, firms learned to predict which neighborhoods would gentrify before it happened. They could see in real time where migration, jobs, and infrastructure projects would push prices higher. They didn't follow the market, they created it. And New York became the ultimate experiment. Apartment buildings in Queens and the Bronx were quietly bought, flipped, and restructured into corporate portfolios. Every transaction looked ordinary, but together they formed a pattern, a silent consolidation of control. The rent-stabilized building on the corner, now part of an institutional REIT, The old brownstone owned by a local family for decades, bought by a holding company tied to a pension fund in California. Each deal by itself seemed small, almost invisible. But when you stepped back, the picture became clear. The city was being re-engineered, property by property, into a machine for generating yield. The story of Wall Street's takeover wasn't one of sudden conquest, but of quiet absorption. The system evolved around us, and by the time most realized it, the rules had changed. In the 1980s, finance discovered derivatives, the ability to trade risk itself. In the 2010s, they discovered something even more powerful, the ability to trade people's homes. Every lease renewal, every rent payment, every eviction notice, it all became data, structured into digital assets, feeding the next round of financial products. Mortgage-backed securities had caused the last crash. Now, rental-backed securities were the new frontier, and once again it was the same pattern: profit first, people second. The corporate landlords argued that they were bringing efficiency to a broken market. "We provide professional management," they said. "We're stabilizing neighborhoods." But the data told another story. Rent burdens soared, maintenance complaints rose, and eviction rates, especially in cities like Atlanta and Tampa, doubled in neighborhoods dominated by institutional ownership. In New York, the effect was subtler but more insidious. Private equity didn't just own properties. They influenced zoning boards, lobbied city officials, and shaped policy through campaign donations. The very institutions meant to regulate housing were being steered by those profiting from it. The promise of capitalism had always been that markets serve people, but in housing that logic inverted. People now served the market. Meanwhile, young professionals, the same demographic once promised starter homes, found themselves trapped in a perpetual rent cycle. The dream of ownership moved further away each year, like a mirage on the horizon. For many, renting was no longer a temporary phase, but a lifelong condition. And that was exactly what investors wanted. The longer people rented, the more stable the revenue stream became. The American dream, once built on mortgages, was now sustained by leases. By 2023, institutional landlords had become a permanent fixture of the housing ecosystem. Even traditional builders began catering to them, constructing built-to-rent communities designed specifically for investors, not residents. In one suburban development outside Dallas, a single corporate owner controlled every home on the block. The lawns were uniform, the houses identical, and every lease was managed through an app. It looked like a neighborhood, but it functioned like a subscription. Back in New York, the symbols of this transformation stood in plain sight. The charging bull of Wall Street, once a metaphor for optimism, now seemed more like a warning. Beneath its bronze glare, the financialization of housing had reached its logical extreme. For the brokers and fund managers, this was the golden era. For millions of renters, it was the age of quiet despair. The housing market no longer reflected supply and demand. It reflected strategy and leverage. And as prices detached from wages, a new kind of inequality took root, one not just of income, but of access. The gap between those who owned assets and those who paid for them had never been wider. And yet, most Americans didn't see it coming. They still believed in the old narrative, that hard work could buy stability, that a mortgage was a path to freedom. They didn't realize that freedom itself had become a commodity, bought, sold, and securitized. In the next part of this story, we'll see how that system began to collapse under its own weight, how the same data-driven machine that fueled Wall Street's rise in housing started turning against it. Because every bubble has a breaking point. And in this one, the stakes weren't just financial, they were human. When the cracks began to appear, they were almost invisible. A delayed payment here, a dip in occupancy rates there, nothing alarming, nothing that couldn't be explained away by the usual economic noise, but beneath the surface, the machine that had turned homes into investments was starting to tremble. It began with interest rates. What Wall Street had built relied on cheap money, endless borrowing at near zero cost. But when the Federal Reserve began tightening policy, the foundations shifted. Suddenly, the cost of leverage, the very oxygen of the housing investment engine, started to rise. Private equity firms that had once borrowed billions to buy homes at scale found themselves exposed. Refinancing became expensive, profits shrank, and the same financial acrobatics that once made housing such a lucrative bet began to work in reverse. For the first time in years, some of the biggest landlords in America were running at a loss. But unlike an ordinary property owner, they couldn't just wait it out. They had investors to answer to, quarterly expectations to meet, and balance sheets that demanded growth at all costs. So they turned to the only lever they still controlled: rent. Across cities like Dallas, Phoenix, and Tampa, rent increases began outpacing inflation by double digits. Algorithms were instructed to push prices higher, even when tenants couldn't afford them, under the assumption that demand would always rebound. But the models were wrong. People started leaving. Units sat empty. The endless upward spiral of rent had finally met its limit. In New York, the shift was more psychological. For years, Wall Street's dominance in housing had been seen as inevitable, even efficient. But now, as stories of neglect and corporate evictions filled the news, the narrative began to change. The same companies that had once been praised for professionalizing the rental market were now being accused of hollowing it out. In Queens, tenants organized against a private equity firm that owned half the block. In the Bronx, renters began a campaign called Homes Not Holdings, demanding to know who actually owned their buildings. In Brooklyn, young professionals who had once shrugged at rising rents started to realize they were part of a system that treated them as data points, not residents. The tension was building, and it was only a matter of time before it broke. By late 2025, a wave of defaults began to ripple through the corporate housing sector. As interest payments ballooned and refinancing options evaporated, several large landlords quietly began unloading properties. But there was a problem. The buyers were gone. For over a decade, institutional money had driven the housing boom. Without it, demand cratered. Prices began to fall, first slowly, then suddenly. What had once been a story of endless appreciation became one of forced liquidation. It was déjà vu. But this time, the victims weren't just homeowners. They were entire neighborhoods owned by funds that could no longer afford to hold them. Homes were listed for sale in bulk, sometimes by the hundreds. The same blocks that had been symbols of Wall Street's power were now being dismantled, piece by piece. In Atlanta, one of the largest corporate landlords filed for bankruptcy protection. In Las Vegas, a major fund quietly began selling its single-family portfolio to cover debts. And in New York, whispers spread that even the biggest players, the untouchables of the housing market, were looking for exits. It wasn't just a financial problem anymore. It was a political one. As the crisis deepened, public anger grew. Lawmakers began to question how Wall Street had been allowed to own such a vast share of America's housing stock in the first place. Hearings were held, documents were subpoenaed, and for the first time in a generation, the concept of housing as a human right re-entered the national conversation. Journalists uncovered internal memos showing that some funds had deliberately under-maintained properties to cut costs. Others had evicted entire buildings to reposition them for higher-paying tenants. What had been framed as modernization now looked like exploitation. And yet, even as the outrage spread, the deeper truth remained. The system hadn't malfunctioned. It had worked exactly as designed. Housing had been financialized, monetized, and optimized until the people living inside it were secondary. The collapse wasn't a failure of capitalism, it was its logical conclusion. In New York, the consequences were visible everywhere. Empty luxury towers stood as monuments to speculation, while working families crowded into shrinking spaces. Eviction filings spiked, not because of delinquency, but because ownership structures were collapsing. Property managers disappeared, phone numbers went dead, maintenance stopped altogether. The city had become a paradox, overbuilt and unaffordable at the same time. And through it all, Wall Street watched from its towers, trying to calculate how to pivot. Some firms rebranded, calling themselves housing innovators. Others launched new funds aimed at distressed real estate. In other words, buying the same homes they had just foreclosed on, only cheaper. The cycle was repeating itself, but this time, the public was watching. In downtown Manhattan, protests returned to the steps of the stock exchange. Demonstrators carried signs reading, "We pay, you profit, and homes are not assets." For the first time in years, the anger was not about mortgages, but about rent. It was no longer a homeowner's rebellion, it was a tenant uprising. And yet, amid the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Cities started to fight back. In California, a coalition of mayors proposed a bill that would restrict corporate ownership of single-family homes. In Minnesota, state legislators drafted a law giving tenants the right of first refusal when their building was sold. And in New York, a new movement emerged, one that sought to reclaim the very idea of housing itself. Community land trusts gained traction, cooperatives reappeared, non-profits began buying distressed buildings not for profit, but for permanence. The goal was no longer speculation, it was stability. It wasn't a revolution in the cinematic sense. No towers fell, no markets crashed overnight, but slowly the tide began to turn. For the first time in decades, ordinary people were rediscovering a power they didn't know they still had. Collective ownership, solidarity, and local control. The Wall Street takeover had transformed homes into assets, but it had also exposed the fragility of that model. When housing becomes purely financial, it loses the one thing that makes it sustainable: humanity. In the aftermath, the financial sector began to adapt again, but this time under scrutiny. Investors spoke of ethical real estate. Firms began publishing ESG reports about community impact. But behind the language, the question lingered: had anything truly changed? The charging bull still stood at Bowling Green, polished by tourists, frozen mid-charge. To some, it was still a symbol of American strength. But for those who had lived through the housing turmoil, it had come to represent something else. A monument to greed, to cycles repeating, to lessons unlearned. As the city moved forward, it carried the memory of what had happened, how homes became assets, how neighborhoods became data, and how the line between living and investing blurred beyond recognition. And yet, amid the glass towers and the spreadsheets, one truth refused to disappear: that housing at its core is not about profit, it's about belonging. The future of America's housing market will depend on which of those ideas survives the next crisis. Because even when the markets recover, even when the funds regroup, the question remains: who will own the next generation's homes? And will they be investors, or the people who actually live in them?